I blinked, and my porch was gone. One minute I was sipping coffee, next minute, boom, half the wall was in the driveway. They said it was procedural. That's what they called bringing in 3 bulldozers without notice. I thought stuff like this only happened in those wild internet stories, but then it was me standing in the middle of it. The fines, the threats, the meetings. I wasn't invited to. It started piling up fast. It didn't feel random. It felt targeted, like someone wanted me out and wasn't going to stop until I broke. Comment what you would have done if your home was next. The ground shook under me as the bulldozer roared through the wall, splinters of the cabin. I built with my own hands flew past my face. They didn't know I was a retired cop. They were about to find out. But let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started, because what happened that morning was just the explosive climax of months of systematic harassment that began the day I thought I'd finally found peace. I'm 35 years old, been a cop for 12 years here in Dallas, and honestly, the job was wearing me down. After years of chasing fraud through city contracts, I thought I'd finally escaped into silence, until that silence was broken by her heels on gravel. When I inherited my grandfather's old property on the outskirts of the city, I thought maybe I'd found my escape. The land wasn't much to look at, just 2 acres of scrubland with a few oak trees, but it was mine. I chose this location carefully. Old habits from the force die hard. Visibility, exit routes, silence. Those 3 months of construction were probably the happiest I'd been since joining the force. Every evening after work, I'd drive out there with Buddy bouncing around in the passenger seat, his tail going crazy because he knew we were heading to his favorite place. We'd work until sunset, me hammering boards into place while he chased squirrels or just lay in the shade watching me work. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, maybe 800 square feet with a small porch and a stone fireplace I'd built myself. But sitting there in the evenings with a beer watching Buddy sniff around the property while the fire crackled, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 12 years as a cop. For the first time in 12 years as a cop, I had found my sanctuary. The trouble started about 2 weeks after I finished the cabin. I came home from a particularly rough shift and found this thick envelope wedged in my front door. At first I thought it might be some charity invitation, or maybe something from the county about property taxes. Boy, was I wrong. The return address read, Sunset Hills Community Association, which meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. But curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it while Buddy was eating his dinner. What I found inside made me laugh out loud, which probably wasn't the reaction they were going for. When I opened that thick envelope, I thought it was some charity invitation. Turns out it was the constitution of a mini empire, right in my own neighborhood. I read through it and laughed at every line, wondering if they wanted to control how I breathed too. 47 pages of rules and regulations, about everything from acceptable paint colors to grass height to trash can placement. The annual membership fee was $1,200, which was supposed to cover community beautification efforts and property value protection. And these people wanted to control what flowers I could plant, where I could park my truck, even what kind of outdoor furniture was considered aesthetically appropriate. Honestly, I found it amusing thinking this was just the hobby of some very bored people. The first violation notice arrived 3 days later. Apparently my grass was exceeding the maximum allowable height of 3 inches and needed immediate attention. The fine was $50 per day until the issue was resolved. I actually went outside with a tape measure to check because I couldn't believe anyone would be that petty. 2.9 inches. My grass was 2.9 inches tall, which by any reasonable person's standards was well within their ridiculous 3-inch limit. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake or some overzealous volunteer misreading the rules. This was intentional. Someone was targeting me specifically, and they were using these regulations as weapons. I decided to ignore the letter, figuring any reasonable person would see how absurd the whole situation was. 2 days later, another notice arrived, this time about my unauthorized cabin color. According to the HOA regulations, all structures had to be painted in colors from their approved palette, and natural wood stain apparently wasn't on the list. They wanted me to paint my beautiful cedar cabin some bland beige or gray that would match every other soulless house in the neighborhood. The fine for this violation was $100 per day. So now I'm looking at $150 per day in fines for grass that was within regulations and a cabin that looked better than anything else in a 5-mile radius. That evening, I sat down at my computer and started researching HOA authority in Texas. I'm a cop, so I know how to investigate things, and what I found was both enlightening and terrifying. HOAs in Texas have significant power, including the ability to place liens on properties for unpaid fines. A lien means they could eventually force the sale of my house if I didn't pay their ridiculous penalties. The more I read, the more I realized that whoever was running this operation was playing fast and loose with the law. They were counting on people being too intimidated or too broke to fight back. Well, they picked the wrong guy this time. The HOA president's name was Paula Granger, and a quick online search told me everything I needed to know about her. 52 years old, blonde hair, always perfectly styled, and apparently she'd been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for 6 years. The neighborhood gossip sites were full of stories about families who'd been forced to sell and move because they couldn't keep up with her escalating fines and harassment. Reading those stories, I felt something click into place. This wasn't random. Paula had a pattern, and I was just the latest target in her campaign to control every aspect of life in this community. But here's the thing about targeting a cop. We don't scare easily, and we definitely don't back down from bullies. I began cross-referencing HOA actions with Texas state laws building a legal case instead of just defending myself. Paula was applying double standards, strict regulations for me, but lenient treatment for other houses with more elaborate landscaping. That's when I decided not to pay the fines and wrote a letter requesting Paula explain specifically what authority she had to enforce these violations. As I sealed that letter, I wondered if I was making the right move. Part of me thought maybe I should just pay the fines and move on with my life. But then I looked out at Buddy sleeping peacefully on his favorite rug, and I thought about all those other families who'd been driven away by this woman's power trips. She handed me a folded letter with the HOA seal. Non-compliant structure subject to removal. I stared at her. "You can't be serious." She smiled. "You'll see." Paula Granger didn't just respond to my letter. She escalated to nuclear levels. Instead of addressing my questions about her authority, she sent me a final notice warning that she was placing a lien on my property if I didn't pay $1,850 within 10 days. Let me repeat that. $1,850 in 10 days, or they could eventually take my house. A lien means they could eventually take my house if I didn't pay these ridiculous fines. In Texas, HOAs have that power, which is terrifying when you think about it. I dropped the folder. Buddy jumped at the sound. My hand was clenched so hard around the pen it snapped. I spent the night combing through documents, land deeds, obscure bylaws, even archived newsletters marking every line where they'd overstepped. But this time, instead of just reading regulations, I began cross-referencing HOA actions with Texas state laws, building a legal case instead of just defending myself. Over the next week, I spent every free moment diving into HOA law, property rights, and the specific regulations governing homeowner associations in Texas. What I found was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. Paula was operating way outside her legal authority, applying regulations selectively and using intimidation tactics that bordered on harassment. One file had been accessed weeks before I moved in by someone named P. Holloway. I hadn't submitted it yet. That's when I met Harold Myers. He was walking his ancient beagle past my house one evening when he stopped to chat. Harold mentioned he's seen this pattern before with other families who couldn't take the pressure anymore. 60 years old, retired mechanic lived in the neighborhood for 10 years, and he had stories that made my blood boil. Harold told me about families who'd been fined into bankruptcy, elderly people forced to sell their homes, and anyone who didn't fit Paula's vision of suburban perfection, getting systematically harassed until they gave up and moved away. Hearing Harold mention other families, something clicked. This wasn't random harassment. This was a systematic campaign. But why target specific houses instead of just pointing out violations? I systematically prepared a case showing Paula's actions violated state oversight requirements. I spent hours at the county courthouse pulling records and researching precedents. I contacted the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs to understand the oversight requirements for HOAs. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to challenge her authority legally. The question was whether I was ready to commit to that level of warfare. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, not to complain, but to present my findings to the entire board and community. If Paula wanted to play this game, I was going to play it better than she ever could. The HOA meeting was held in the community center on a Tuesday evening. I'd never attended one before, but I figured it was time to make my presence known. The meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with Paula sitting at a table in front, while about 20 homeowners sat in folding chairs facing her. She was exactly what I'd expected from her online photos. Perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive suit, the kind of condescending smile that politicians use when they're about to screw you over. When she called for new business, I stood up with my folder of research. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. I didn't raise my voice or show anger. Instead, I calmly asked Paula to explain how the HOA's selective enforcement aligned with Texas property code requirements. "Officer Martinez," she said, her smile never wavering, but her eyes going cold. "I'm so glad you could join us. I trust you received our final notice regarding the violations on your property." The way she said final notice, like it was some kind of threat, made me want to arrest her on principle. Instead, I pulled out the copies I'd prepared. "Actually, Mrs. Granger, I have some questions about the authority and procedures this board has been using. I think the community deserves to understand exactly what powers you claim to have and where those powers come from." For the next 20 minutes, I systematically presented evidence showing how her enforcement violated state law. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted her scarf. She spoke louder, but not steadier. "You're not just breaking rules, you're dismantling order. And I won't let one man ruin what took years to build." Paula snapped, her mask finally slipping. The way she said it told me everything I needed to know about her real motivations. "I'm not questioning your intentions, Mrs. Granger," I replied calmly. "I'm questioning your methods, and more importantly, your legal authority to implement them." By the time I was done, several board members were asking for copies of my research, and Paula's perfect composure was starting to crack. The other homeowners were looking at her differently, and she knew it. Her little kingdom was starting to crumble, and she didn't like it one bit. "You're not the first one she's driven out," a man whispered to me as we left the meeting, "but you might be the last." The meeting ended with Paula calling for adjournment in a voice that could have frozen water. As people filed out, several homeowners stopped to thank me for speaking up. Harold clapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "About time someone stood up to her." But I could see the worry in his eyes too. We both knew that cornering someone like Paula was dangerous. Bullies don't just give up when confronted, they escalate. Meeting ended with several board members requesting copies of my research. Paula realized she's lost control of the narrative, and I had a feeling she wasn't going to take this public humiliation lying down. I pulled out the survey map again. There it was, one faded red line tracing directly through my property labeled Phase 4 Expansion. I wasn't just a nuisance, I was in the way. I didn't wait around to see what Paula's next move would be. The morning after that HOA meeting, I was already at the courthouse filing a civil lawsuit against the HOA and Paula personally. I wasn't just responding to her harassment anymore. I was taking the offensive, seeking an injunction to stop her from targeting me or any other homeowner, plus $25,000 in damages for the stress and financial harm she'd caused. An injunction is basically a court order that would stop Paula from harassing me or any other homeowner, and I had enough evidence to make it stick. Looking back, maybe I should have anticipated how someone like Paula would react to being cornered legally. They thought I'd react like a homeowner. I was a former interrogator. I didn't need a permit. I needed a pressure point. The lawsuit was filed on a Wednesday. By Friday morning, Harold was calling me at work, and he sounded panicked. "John, you need to get out to your place right now. There's some kind of heavy machinery out there, and men in hard hats. I don't know what they're doing, but it doesn't look good." I told my sergeant I had a family emergency and drove out there faster than I probably should have. What I found when I arrived still makes my blood boil just thinking about it. A bulldozer was systematically tearing apart my cabin, the place where Buddy and I had spent 3 months building our sanctuary. The noise was incredible, metal groaning and wood splintering, and there was Paula Granger sitting in her car about 50 yards away, watching the destruction with her phone out, recording everything like it was some kind of entertainment. Buddy howled like he hadn't since the city riots. He tried to run back into the cabin. I had to grab his collar and drag him away as the walls cracked. In all his 3 years, he'd never seen violence like this directed at his home, the place where he felt safe and happy. The confusion and fear in his eyes broke something inside me that I'm not sure ever fully healed. This wasn't just property damage anymore. This was psychological warfare against me and my dog, and Paula was enjoying every second of it. I didn't feel heartbroken or devastated like you might expect. I felt something much more dangerous. I felt completely focused, like I was responding to an active crime scene, which in many ways, I was. When Paula saw me arrive, she actually got out of her car and walked over carrying some kind of official-looking document. She wasn't gloating or smiling like I expected. Instead, she had this cold business-like expression, like she was just handling a routine administrative matter. "Officer Martinez," she said, handing me the paper. "This is a court order authorizing the removal of unpermitted structures from your property. Everything we're doing here is completely legal and proper." I looked at the document, then at her, then back at the bulldozer that was finishing the job of destroying 3 months of my work. "Mrs. Granger," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "I've been a cop for 12 years. I know a fake court order when I see one." For the first time since I'd met her, I saw real uncertainty flicker across Paula's face. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Maybe I am," I replied, pulling out my phone, "but you're about to find out." While the bulldozer operator took a break, I started making calls to verify the authenticity of her documentation. I called Harris, my old internal affairs partner. "You still got that folder on HOA embezzlement? I've got something for you." I also began treating this like what it was, an active crime scene. I photographed everything methodically, the destruction, the machinery, Paula's car, even her recording me with her phone. I documented the serial numbers on the bulldozer and took pictures of the operator's license plate. What I discovered during those phone calls was both infuriating and enlightening. The court order was real, but it had been obtained using completely false information. Paula had filed paperwork claiming that my cabin violated multiple permit requirements and posed safety hazards to the community. None of that was true, but she'd presented enough official-looking documentation to convince a judge who probably processed dozens of similar requests every week. The permit violations she claimed didn't actually exist, and the safety hazards were completely fabricated. She'd committed fraud to get that court order, which meant she'd just escalated this from a civil matter to a criminal one. I didn't need more proof. What I needed now was leverage. The bulldozer finished its work within 2 hours. What had taken Buddy and me 3 months to build was reduced to a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal in less time than it takes to watch a movie. But here's the thing about being a cop. You learn not to let emotions cloud your judgment when you're dealing with criminals. As painful as it was to watch my sanctuary get destroyed, I knew that Paula had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd committed multiple felonies in broad daylight with witnesses, and I had the evidence to prove it. "Mrs. Granger," I said as the bulldozer operator started loading his equipment back onto the trailer, "I hope you enjoyed this little show, because what happens next is going to be a lot less fun for you." She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks starting to show. "You can file all the complaints you want, Officer Martinez. Everything we did here was legal and necessary for community safety." The way she emphasized community safety told me she actually believed her own lies, which made her more dangerous than I'd initially thought. Delusional people with power are unpredictable, and I was starting to understand that Paula Granger was far more unstable than she appeared on the surface. As I loaded a traumatized Buddy into my truck and drove away from the ruins of our peaceful retreat, I made myself a promise. This woman had just declared war on the wrong person, and I was going to make sure she paid for every single crime she'd committed. As the dust settled, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I opened the drawer where I kept the badge I never turned in. Time to use it one last time. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I called Detective Lily Monroe, my close colleague who specializes in financial crimes, and asked her to meet me for coffee. Lily's been investigating white-collar criminals for 8 years, and if anyone could help me figure out what Paula Granger was really up to, it was her. When I told her about the cabin destruction and showed her copies of all the documentation, her reaction surprised me. Instead of sympathy or outrage, she got that focused look she gets when she's spotted something bigger than what's on the surface. "John," she said, studying the fake court order, "this isn't just harassment. This is organized fraud and probably money laundering too. Document fraud means using fake or altered official papers to commit crimes, and it's a serious felony in Texas. We decided to treat this like what it was, a criminal investigation. Instead of just focusing on my case, Lily suggested we look at the bigger picture. Who else had Paula targeted? Where was the money going? And most importantly, who was benefiting financially from driving families out of the neighborhood? Over the next week, we spent every free hour we had digging through public records, tracking financial transactions, and interviewing other victims of Paula's harassment campaigns. What we found was shocking, even by the standards of someone who'd been investigating criminals for over a decade. Paula, the woman who once drew blueprints, now redrew lives and erased mine. She was running a sophisticated real estate scheme that had been operating for at least 3 years. Using her expertise in financial crimes, Lily traced the money trail that led from Paula's HOA enforcement actions to a network of shell companies and real estate transactions. A shell company is basically a fake business used to hide who's really buying or selling property, and Paula had created 3 of them over the past 2 years. Each of these companies had been purchasing foreclosed or distressed properties in the neighborhood at below market prices, properties that just happened to belong to families who'd been harassed into selling by escalating HOA fines and violations. The pattern was clear. Once you knew what to look for, Paula would target a family with systematic harassment, force them to sell at a loss, then have one of her shell companies buy the property cheap and flip it for a substantial profit. But the smoking gun came when Lily found email correspondence between Paula and a developer named Mark Stevens discussing something they called a Phase 2 acquisition plan. In these emails, they referred to my property as the final acquisition target and discussed strategies for forcing me to sell. The emails made it clear that my cabin wasn't just an aesthetic problem for Paula. It was an obstacle to a multi-million-dollar development project that required assembling several contiguous properties, including mine. Seeing this level of calculated manipulation in a suburban neighborhood was something else entirely. These people had turned an HOA into a criminal enterprise. The more we dug, the more we realized that Paula's operation was even bigger than we'd initially thought. She wasn't just targeting individual homeowners. She was systematically reshaping entire neighborhoods to benefit her development partners, using HOA regulations as weapons to force out anyone who didn't fit her vision or wouldn't sell at the price she wanted to pay. Lily's database searches revealed that similar patterns were occurring in at least 3 other neighborhoods where Paula had consulting relationships with their HOAs. The woman had essentially franchised her harassment model, teaching other HOA boards how to use selective enforcement and escalating fines to control property values and resident demographics. While we were building our criminal case, Paula made another critical mistake. Instead of laying low after the cabin destruction, she launched a public relations campaign telling neighbors that I was a disgruntled homeowner trying to destroy property values, and encouraging them to support the HOA's necessary actions to maintain community standards. She held a community meeting where she presented a slideshow about the importance of uniform neighborhood aesthetics and the dangers of allowing non-conforming structures to remain in place. What she didn't know was that Harold Myers had been recording the meeting on his phone, and some of her statements were direct admissions of the conspiracy we were investigating. In that recording, Paula explicitly discussed her partnerships with community-minded investors and her long-term vision for neighborhood improvement through strategic property acquisition. She talked about the substantial community benefits that would result from removing certain problematic elements from the neighborhood. "This community doesn't bend for people like you," she said at one point, her voice rising with frustration when someone questioned her methods. To anyone listening casually, it sounded like standard HOA rhetoric about property values. But to someone trained in recognizing criminal conspiracy, it was a confession. She was admitting to using her position to facilitate illegal property acquisitions, and she was doing it in front of 24 witnesses. By the end of the week, we had documented evidence of conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and organized criminal activity involving multiple parties and potentially affecting dozens of families across several neighborhoods. The evidence was so extensive that Lily recommended we bring it directly to the district attorney's office rather than filing it through normal channels. This wasn't just a local HOA dispute anymore. It was a major white-collar crime case that could result in federal charges if the money trail crossed state lines. Paula Granger had gone from being a neighborhood nuisance to being the center of what might become one of the biggest real estate fraud cases in Dallas County history. Looking at all that evidence spread across Lily's dining room table, I knew we had Paula cornered. But as any cop will tell you, cornered animals are the most dangerous ones. Paula had already shown she was willing to commit felonies to get what she wanted, and she had connections to people with serious money and power. The question wasn't whether we could build a case against her. The question was what she might do when she realized her entire criminal enterprise was about to come crashing down. She slammed the folder shut, but I'd already seen it. A ledger, coded payments. My name was on the last line, flagged for removal. The next step was bringing in the big guns. AD Michael Thompson had been prosecuting white-collar crimes in Dallas County for 15 years. And when Lily and I walked into his office with 3 boxes of evidence, I could see his eyes light up. This was the kind of case that prosecutors dream about: clear criminal activity, documented financial fraud, and enough evidence to bury the defendants in legal paperwork. "Officer Martinez," he said, after reviewing our initial findings, "what you've uncovered here isn't just HOA abuse. This is organized criminal activity under Texas law, plus document fraud and money laundering. We're looking at potential sentences of 15 to 20 years for the main conspirators." Money laundering means disguising illegal money by making it look like it came from legitimate business activities, and Paula had been doing exactly that through her shell companies. Thompson's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of just building a case based on documents and financial records, he wanted to get Paula to confess on tape. "The best evidence in conspiracy cases is when the defendants incriminate themselves," he explained. "If we can get her talking about the scheme in her own words, it becomes very difficult for a jury to ignore." He suggested what's called a controlled meet, where I would wear a wire and try to get Paula to admit to the conspiracy while recording everything. The idea was for me to call Paula and claim I wanted to work something out, because my legal bills were mounting, and I just wanted to rebuild my cabin elsewhere. What if I'd misread all of this? What if I was chasing shadows in my own rage? But no, they broke my walls. Time to break their shield. Setting up the meeting wasn't as hard as I expected. When I called Paula and suggested we meet to discuss finding a mutually acceptable solution, she jumped at the chance. I think she genuinely believed that destroying my cabin had broken my spirit and that I was ready to surrender. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown Neutral Territory, where she'd feel comfortable talking freely. The wire setup was more sophisticated than what you see in movies. It was a tiny recording device that looked like a button on my shirt, connected to a transmitter that would broadcast everything to a surveillance van parked across the street. Thompson and Lily would be listening to every word, ready to intervene if things went wrong. Buddy wouldn't go near the cabin's ruins. He paced in circles, sleeping by the shed door instead of our porch. The morning of the meeting, I sat in my truck for about 10 minutes, just trying to get my head straight. This woman had destroyed 3 months of my work, traumatized my dog, and committed multiple felonies against me personally. But now I had to sit across from her and pretend I was defeated, that I wanted to negotiate some kind of surrender. The cop part of my brain knew this was just another undercover operation, but the personal part of me wanted to arrest her on the spot. Thompson had been very clear about what I needed to accomplish. Get her talking about the scheme, the shell companies, the partnership with Mark Stevens, and most importantly, get her to admit that the harassment campaign was designed to force me to sell my property below market value. Paula arrived exactly on time, dressed in another one of her expensive suits and carrying a leather briefcase like she was heading to a board meeting. She looked confident, almost smug, like she'd already won some kind of victory by getting me to the table. "Officer Martinez," she said, extending her hand with that same fake smile I'd seen at the HOA meeting. "I'm so glad you called. I really think we can find a way to resolve this situation that benefits everyone involved." The way she said everyone involved made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to smile back and play the role of the defeated homeowner. "Mrs. Granger, I appreciate you taking the time. I'll be honest, this whole legal battle is more expensive than I anticipated, and I'm starting to think maybe there's a better way to handle things." For the next 40 minutes, Paula laid out her entire criminal enterprise without even realizing it. She didn't immediately confess to fraud or conspiracy. Instead, she talked about her vision for improving the neighborhood and her partnerships with investors who shared her commitment to maintaining high property values. "You have to understand, John," she said, using my first name like we were old friends, "individual homeowners, like you don't always see the bigger picture. Mark Stevens and I have been working for 3 years to create something really special in this community. Your little cabin was charming in its own way, but it didn't fit the aesthetic we're developing for the area." The casual way she referred to Mark Stevens and I, and the aesthetic we're developing, was exactly what Thompson needed to prove the conspiracy. When I asked about compensation for my destroyed cabin, Paula made another critical mistake. She started talking about the substantial profits she expected to receive when the neighborhood improvement project was completed. "We're looking at easily 7 figures when everything goes through," she said, gesturing with her coffee cup like she was discussing weekend plans. "The property values in that area are going to increase dramatically once we remove the last few non-conforming elements and bring in the right kind of residents." Hearing her talk about 7 figures while sitting across from the ruins of my simple cabin made my blood run cold, but I forced myself to stay in character. She was essentially admitting to a multi-million-dollar conspiracy while drinking a latte. By the end of the week, I had enough video angles, audio triggers, metadata trails. They'd buried themselves and didn't know it yet. The smoking gun came when Paula started bragging about how she'd solved similar problems in other neighborhoods. She mentioned using community funds for various improvements, including what she called removing non-compliant structures. She was unknowingly admitting to embezzlement using HOA dues to fund her illegal activities. But the most damning statement came near the end of our conversation. When I hesitated about accepting her offer to help me find property elsewhere, Paula's mask slipped just enough to reveal the threat underneath. "I'd hate for you to have more problems with your property, John. Sometimes accidents happen to people who don't know when to let things go." I sent the footage to Harris with one line, "Give this to County DA, quietly." The reply came 10 minutes later. "You've got something. Stay quiet. We're moving." Walking away from that coffee shop, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. Satisfaction, because we had everything we needed on tape to destroy Paula's criminal enterprise. Disgust, because I realized just how many families she'd probably threatened and intimidated over the years. Thompson and Lily were waiting in the surveillance van, both grinning like they'd just won the lottery. "John," Thompson said, "that recording is prosecutorial gold. She just confessed to conspiracy, embezzlement, money laundering, and criminal intimidation all in one conversation. We can have arrest warrants prepared by tomorrow morning." I packed my old notebook, one hidden camera, and Buddy's leash. Tomorrow, the HOA had another meeting, and I'd be there with more than just questions. At dawn the next morning, Dallas police executed simultaneous search warrants on 5 different locations: Paula's home, the HOA office, Mark Stevens's development company, and the addresses of Paula's 3 shell companies. The coordination was impressive, like watching a well-orchestrated military operation. I wasn't directly involved in the arrests since I was a witness in the case, but Lily called me with updates throughout the day. The first call came at 6:30 in the morning. "We got her," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Paula was in her home office trying to shred documents when the officers arrived. She's been arrested in designer pajamas, and she's not handling the situation with her usual composure. The evidence seizure was more extensive than we'd even hoped. Police found computers full of incriminating emails, financial records documenting the shell company transactions, and communications revealing that the conspiracy involved 6 other HOAs across Dallas County. Paula hadn't just been running one criminal enterprise, she'd been franchising her model, teaching other HOA boards how to use harassment and selective enforcement to reshape their communities according to specific demographic and economic preferences. The scope of the operation was staggering. We're talking about dozens of families across multiple neighborhoods who'd been systematically targeted and forced from their homes so Paula and her partners could profit from below-market property acquisitions. Mark Stevens was arrested at his office later that morning, and his reaction was completely different from Paula's. While she'd tried to maintain her dignity and deny everything, Stevens immediately started trying to cut a deal. His attorney contacted the DA's office before lunch, offering to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. The evidence against Stevens was overwhelming. Police found documentation showing he'd been bribing HOA officials, manipulating property assessments, and using shell companies to hide the true ownership of properties he was acquiring through Paula's harassment campaigns. But more importantly, they found evidence that this wasn't just a local operation. The money trail led to investors in 3 different states, potentially making this a federal case. The media attention was immediate and intense. By noon, local news trucks were parked outside the courthouse, and by evening, the story had gone regional. Multi-million-dollar HOA corruption ring, exposed by off-duty police officer, was the headline on every major news outlet in Texas. Reporters were calling it one of the most sophisticated real estate fraud schemes in Dallas County history. I became the reluctant face of HOA reform advocacy, giving interviews about the need for stronger oversight of homeowner associations and better protection for residents facing harassment campaigns. It wasn't a role I'd ever wanted, but if it helped other families avoid what I'd been through, I was willing to do it. The community response was swift and decisive. Within 24 hours of Paula's arrest, an emergency HOA meeting was called to dissolve the current board and organize new elections. Harold Myers volunteered to serve as interim president while the legal mess got sorted out, and his first official act was to suspend all pending violation notices and fines. "We're going to start over," he announced at the packed community meeting. "No more harassment, no more selective enforcement, and definitely no more treating homeowners like criminals for living in their own houses." "You lied to us," someone yelled from the back. "This isn't governance. It's a racket," another muttered, holding up his HOA invoice. The relief in that room was palpable. People who had been living in fear of arbitrary fines and harassment campaigns were finally able to breathe freely. But Paula wasn't done fighting. Despite being presented with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, including the recorded confession from our coffee shop meeting, she refused to accept a plea bargain. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "This is illegal!" she screamed, but nobody moved to help her. Her attorney's strategy seemed to be arguing that she was just an overzealous community leader who'd been manipulated by Mark Stevens and his development partners. Mrs. Granger genuinely believed she was improving property values and protecting the community, her lawyer told reporters. She may have been misguided in her methods, but she never intended to commit fraud or engage in criminal conspiracy. A plea bargain means admitting guilt in exchange for a lighter sentence. But Paula's ego wouldn't let her admit she'd done anything wrong. The trial preparation was extensive. ADA Thompson assembled a prosecution team that included specialists in financial crimes, organized criminal activity, and real estate fraud. They had over 200 pieces of evidence, including the recorded confession, financial records from the shell companies, and testimony from 12 victim families who'd been harassed into selling their homes. The evidence was so comprehensive that Thompson felt confident about securing convictions on all major charges. But Paula's defense team wasn't giving up without a fight. They planned to argue that she was a victim of Mark Stevens' manipulation, that she'd been deceived about the legal implications of her actions, and that her intentions had always been to improve the community rather than profit from illegal activities. Watching the legal machinery grind into motion was both satisfying and exhausting. This woman had destroyed my peace, traumatized my dog, and committed multiple felonies against me personally, but now I had to sit back and let the justice system do its work. The preliminary hearings alone took weeks, with Paula's attorneys filing motion after motion, trying to suppress evidence or get charges dismissed. But Thompson's case was solid, built on documented financial crimes and Paula's own recorded admissions of guilt. Every legal maneuver her defense team attempted just delayed the inevitable. County officers, not HOA security, real badges, not plastic ones. Paula Granger was going to face a jury, and that jury was going to hear her own voice confessing to years of criminal activity. As the trial date approached, I found myself wondering if this was really the end of the story. Paula was in custody, her criminal enterprise was dismantled, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. But something nagged at me about her refusal to accept a plea deal. Most rational people facing 15 to 20 years in prison would try to negotiate a lighter sentence. Paula's insistence on going to trial suggested either complete delusion about her chances of acquittal or one final desperate strategy that we hadn't anticipated yet. For a second, I felt nothing. Then I looked at Buddy, his ears perked. Yeah, we were done here. As they let her out, someone asked, "Will they dissolve the HOA now?" I didn't answer. I had one last stop to make. It took 6 weeks, but I rebuilt the porch. Buddy walked back on it like he'd never left. I carved one word into the beam above us: ours. The trial had begun on a crisp October morning in Dallas County District Court, with the judge presiding. Jury selection took 3 days longer than expected because Paula's defense team kept trying to exclude anyone who'd had negative experiences with HOAs. They were looking for jurors who might be sympathetic to the idea that Paula was just a dedicated community leader who'd gotten in over her head. But Thompson's team made sure the final jury included people who understood the difference between legitimate community standards and systematic harassment campaigns. Looking at those 12 faces in the jury box, I felt cautiously optimistic that justice might finally be served. As the primary witness and victim, I was the prosecution's first major testimony. Walking into that courtroom and seeing Paula sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit instead of one of her expensive suits was surreal. For months, she'd been this untouchable figure wielding HOA regulations like weapons against anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. Now she was just another defendant facing serious felony charges. Thompson walked me through the entire timeline methodically, from the first ridiculous violation notice about my grass height to the bulldozer destruction of my cabin. My testimony took almost a full day, and I could see the jury's reactions when I described finding Buddy cowering behind my truck, terrified by the violence directed at his home. The evidence presentation was devastating. Thompson didn't just rely on my testimony and the recorded confession. He brought in 12 other victim families who described similar harassment campaigns, escalating fines, and systematic intimidation designed to force them to sell their properties below market value. The financial evidence was equally damning. Lily testified about the shell company network, the money laundering through fake business transactions, and the email correspondence between Paula and Mark Stevens discussing their acquisition strategy. When the prosecution played the coffee shop recording, Paula's voice filled the courtroom, calmly discussing seven-figure profits and threatening me with accidents if I didn't cooperate. Paula's defense strategy was predictable but ineffective. Her attorneys tried to portray her as a victim of Mark Stevens' manipulation, arguing that she'd been deceived about the legal implications of her actions and genuinely believed she was protecting property values. They brought in character witnesses who testified about her volunteer work and community involvement, trying to convince the jury that she wasn't capable of the calculated criminal activity she was accused of. But their case fell apart during cross-examination. Thompson methodically demonstrated that Paula had initiated most of the harassment campaigns, created the shell companies herself, and been the driving force behind the entire conspiracy. The most damaging moment for Paula's defense came when she decided to testify on her own behalf. Against her attorney's advice, she took the stand and tried to explain away 3 years of criminal activity as misguided community service. She claimed that Mark Stevens had convinced her that aggressive HOA enforcement was necessary to prevent neighborhood decline, and that she'd never intended to profit personally from forcing families to sell their homes. But Thompson's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. He played back portions of the recorded confession that directly contradicted her testimony, showing the jury that she was lying under oath about her motivations and level of involvement. The moment that sealed Paula's fate came when Thompson asked her to explain the email where she referred to my property as the final acquisition target. Paula tried to claim that she'd been referring to aesthetic improvements rather than forced property acquisition, but the context made her explanation absurd. The jury didn't just hear her words, they heard her pride in what she'd accomplished and her complete lack of remorse for the families she'd destroyed. "Mrs. Granger," Thompson said during his closing argument, "this isn't the voice of someone who was deceived or manipulated. This is the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and enjoyed every minute of it." After only 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts: organized criminal activity, money laundering, document fraud, embezzlement, and criminal intimidation. Mark Stevens had already been convicted in a separate trial and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. When the judge asked Paula if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood up and delivered one final speech about protecting community standards and maintaining property values. Even facing decades in prison, she couldn't admit that what she'd done was wrong. Her complete lack of remorse probably added years to her sentence. The judge sentenced Paula to 15 years for organized criminal activity and 10 concurrent years for money laundering, plus full restitution of $3.2 million to all victims. During the victim impact portion of sentencing, Harold and other affected families addressed the court, describing not just their financial losses, but the emotional trauma of being systematically harassed and driven from their homes. "Your Honor," Harold said, his voice shaking with emotion, "this woman didn't just steal our money, she stole our sense of security in our own homes. She made us afraid to check our mailboxes, afraid to plant flowers in our own yards, afraid to live our lives freely. As the bailiff led Paula away in shackles, she looked back at me one last time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something I'd seen in many criminals over the years. 3 other HOAs collapsed within months. The Attorney General called our case a structural rot exposed. Let them name it whatever they want. I call it justice. The civil resolution came 6 months later. The HOA's insurance company settled for $150,000, and Paula's seized assets provided another $75,000. Other victims recovered a total of $1.8 million through various insurance claims and asset seizures. But the money was never really the point. What mattered was that a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation had been exposed and stopped. I used my settlement to build a new cabin larger and sturdier than the first one. But this time, I wasn't just building for Buddy and me. 6 months after Paula's sentencing, I did something that surprised even me. I established the Martinez Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing legal aid to families facing HOA abuse across the country. Our first case was a family in Houston, facing the exact same tactics Paula had used on us. The Martinez Foundation's success led to legislative reform, and what started as one cop's fight against a neighborhood bully became a nationwide movement for HOA accountability. Paula is still serving her sentence in federal prison, and every time someone calls our foundation's hotline about HOA abuse, I remember why this whole journey was necessary. Because no one should have to face these bullies alone. I poured 2 coffees mine and one for the empty chair beside me. Old habits. I sat there a while watching the steam curl up from both mugs. The chair across from me stayed empty, but somehow it didn't feel lonely. Maybe because for the first time in years, everything was quiet, and it wasn't the kind of quiet they forced on me with fear. It was earned. I never wanted to be a public face of anything, but if the fight they dragged me into ends up protecting someone else, maybe it was worth every sleepless night. Maybe the real lesson here is just because someone has power doesn't mean they're right, and just because you're alone doesn't mean you're powerless. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced something that felt bigger than you? And if this story meant something to you and you want to support more, like it, feel free to tap the thanks button below. It helps more than you know. I'll be right here. Same porch, same coffee. You know where to find me.
QA Stories is all about the wildest things real people go through. And we're just getting started. Like, share, and stay tuned for more madness.